Officers involved were charged and their case assigned, through a random but lawful process, to Judge Amara Lewis. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief. Defense attorneys filed motions claiming conflict, bias, coincidence too perfect to be real. But every motion failed under scrutiny because Amara had done nothing wrong except exist and persist. And when the day of trial arrived, she walked into the courtroom with the same measured steps she'd practiced for years. Robe flowing, expression unreadable, and that's when the laughter died, because the officers recognized her, recognized the eyes first, then the face, and finally the scar near her temple from a childhood fall she'd never hidden. And one of them went pale while another whispered a curse, because power, when reversed, reveals truth. The third twist unfolded not in spectacle but in restraint, because Amara did not grandstand, did not glare, did not reference the past unless it was entered into evidence by the prosecution. And that discipline unnerved the defense more than rage ever could. Witnesses testified, experts explained, and when the photos were shown, blurred for the public but unmistakable to those involved, the courtroom felt smaller, heavier, and the jurors watched the officers' earlier bravado crumble into defensiveness, then into silence. Outside, commentators argued whether justice could be impartial when history sat so close, but inside, the law moved forward step by step, and when it came time for verdicts, guilty findings landed like stones dropped into still water, each ripple touching lives far beyond that room. The final twist came at sentencing, when Amara spoke. Not about revenge, not about pain, but about responsibility, about how institutions rot when cruelty is rewarded and accountability is delayed, about how laughter can become evidence if someone is patient enough to remember, and her words were measured, devastating, and impossible to dismiss, because they were rooted not in bitterness but in record, and as sentences were read, the same officers who once joked under fluorescent lights stood bowed, realizing too late that they had underestimated silence. The story didn't end there because it never does. As reforms followed, training changed, oversight strengthened, and young law students cited Judge Lewis in essays about judicial temperament and moral clarity. While somewhere in the city, a grandmother smiled at a photograph of her granddaughter on a courthouse wall, knowing that hair grows back but courage, once proven, becomes legacy. And if you're listening to this from anywhere in America wondering whether systems can change or whether your voice matters, remember this. Justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives patient, prepared, and wearing a robe. So if stories like Amara's deserve to be told and remembered, subscribe now, stay with us, and share the story, because silence can be powerful, but only when it's finally broken. Before you scroll another inch, stop, because this is one of those true-to-the-bone stories that America needs to hear right now. And if you believe stories like this matter, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with us, because what you're about to hear begins with laughter and ends in a courtroom so silent you could hear a heartbeat echo off the walls, and that silence changed lives forever. The night they shaved her head, the cops thought it was funny, thought it was just another late shift, another name on a clipboard, another black woman who wouldn't be believed if she spoke up. And as the clippers buzzed and chunks of her hair fell to the cold concrete floor, they laughed, joked, nudged each other, and took pictures they swore would never see daylight, because power has a way of making people sloppy. And they never asked her name, never wondered who she was beyond the charge typed into the system, never imagined that the woman sitting rigid in that holding room, jaw clenched, eyes burning but dry, was memorizing every sound, every face, every badge number, filing them away like evidence in a case she hadn't even opened yet, because her name was Amara Lewis and silence had never been her weakness. It had been her strategy, and long before that night. Long before the cuffs bit into her wrists over a misunderstanding that escalated because she refused to lower her eyes, Amara had learned how systems worked, how they pretended to be neutral while grinding certain people down, how cruelty often hid behind procedure, and how patience could be sharper than any blade. She grew up in a narrow brick house on the south side of a city that loved her labor but feared her confidence, raised by a grandmother who pressed her hair every Sunday morning while explaining the difference between dignity and submission, telling her that hair was history, memory, survival braided into strands, and that anyone who tried to take it from you was trying to take more than beauty. They were trying to take proof that you belonged to yourself. And that lesson echoed in Amara's head as the clippers scraped her scalp, as officers made crude comments about how easier she looked now, as one of them said she should be grateful they were helping her, and through it all she said nothing, because she understood something they didn't. Words spoken in that room would be twisted, but silence could be weaponized later. The charge against her was minor, a false report, triggered by a neighbor who had mistaken her carrying boxes into her own apartment as suspicious, and by morning she was released, given a plastic bag with her belongings and a look that said she should disappear quietly. But Amara walked out into the pale dawn with her head uncovered, feeling the cold on skin that had never felt it before, and she made a decision that would take years to fully unfold, a decision that would require discipline so relentless it bordered on obsession. Because she wasn't going to scream, she wasn't going to beg, and she wasn't going to sue right away. She was going to understand the system so completely that one day it would have no choice but to listen to her. The first twist came when the department quietly destroyed the booking room footage, claiming a malfunction, and when Internal Affairs closed the complaint citing lack of evidence, friends urged her to move on, to focus on healing, but Amara knew healing didn't always mean forgetting. Sometimes it meant preparing, so she returned to school, first at night, then full-time, studying law with a focus that startled her professors, because while other students debated hypotheticals, Amara asked about procedure, precedent, the exact thresholds that separated misconduct from criminal liability, and she paid for her books by working at a legal clinic where she watched people like herself be dismissed with polite smiles, and she learned how those smiles cracked under pressure. Years passed, her hair grew back in tight curls she wore proudly, and she built a reputation not for anger but for precision, for the way she could dismantle an argument without raising her voice, and somewhere along the way, a clerkship turned into a judgeship appointment in a small but influential jurisdiction, the kind of appointment that made headlines for a day and then faded, except in the police department where a few older officers felt an itch they couldn't place, a memory half buried under bravado. The second twist came when a federal investigation into patterns of abuse reopened cold cases, sparked by a whistleblower who leaked internal emails and photos, including some taken in that booking room years earlier, and suddenly names resurfaced, including Amara's, and when the